Hello and welcome to Grace. My name's Ian and I am delighted to bring today's message. It's entitled, Are You Satisfied with God? And it's a part of our roller coaster series as we take an in-depth look at the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. Before we start, let's have a quick recap. The story of Joseph. All through his life it's been up and down. Hence the roller coaster idea. Starting off with, obviously, his dad's favourite. And it was made clear by dad of the favouritism. And I think the coat typified that status. Having dreams of being worshipped by his brothers, and then again by his dad, his life was on up. Very important. He was special. Well, resented by his brothers bitterly, to the point that they wanted to get rid of him. Cast in a pit, starting to go down. And rather than being killed, sold as a slave, sent to Egypt, traded. But life started to pick up again, working in Potiphar's house. Blessed, given more responsibility, until Potiphar's wife accused him. And he ended up in prison. A new low point. But God was with him. Built up favour with the guards. To the point one time he was interpreting dreams for fellow prisoners. Again, forgotten again. Finally remembered by the cupbearer. In front of Pharaoh, things are starting to rise again. God gives him Pharaoh's dreams and interpretations. Finally recognised and rewarded. Put in a place of high responsibility. Up, up, up. Egypt prepares, and he's central to that plan. Prepares for the forthcoming famine. And then his brothers return to Egypt. And then we've read recently about the shenanigans in the sacks, back and forth, back and forth. Finally, he meets Benjamin. They come back, the brothers, to explain. And Joseph says, no, Benjamin has the cup, he must stay. He must be my slave. Judah pleads to swap for Benji. Pat took us last week into that meeting, that revelation of Joseph to his brothers of who he really was. And she majored on the aspects of freedom. And today, in part of answering the question, are we satisfied with God? I think we need to look at this key meeting once again and focus on the forgiveness element, which I think is a central key point of this chapter, and will help us discuss, are we satisfied with God? So, if I may, we're going to go back a few verses, back to the chapter 45, verse 1, through to verses 8, in more depth, because I believe there's so much here to understand and to consider as a concept. So, let's put ourselves in the brothers' sandals for a moment. Picture the scene. They've been called in by the second most important person in Egypt. You can imagine the conversation, their thoughts. We only wanted some grain. Somehow, the money, the payment has got back in our bags. We're looked as thieves or spies, accused. We've already been in custody over this. There's lots of arguing amongst the group, especially about Joseph. Should we have done that? Lots of recrimination going on. And then Judah. Judah makes his plea. How did that go down? But let's just consider that for a moment. From being one of the original brothers who was more than happy for Joseph to be killed, and then sold as a slave for him now to come before this complete stranger, this Egyptian official, and offer himself as a slave to allow Benjamin to go free. Massive change in character. As a side point, he is obviously the founder of the tribe of Judah, a lineage which will give us David and Solomon, and most importantly, Jesus. And did he not do the same for us as a substitute, as a sacrifice? Back to the story. Perhaps this change in character in Judah was the tipping point for Joseph. We read in verse 1, "Then Joseph could no longer control himself before his attendants." This is an amazing moment, a significant fulcrum event, tipping point in the Old Testament. As we've discussed, the only reason the brothers are in Egypt, as they are aware, is that they need food. The famine is in its second year. Things are getting tough. Egypt was the place to buy grain, the only place. So, all they wanted was to get food. And then all they wanted was to get home, back to Jacob. But what these brothers needed was forgiveness. Now, what they wanted and what they needed were two different things. Joseph gave them what they wanted, but also what they needed. Forgiveness of what they'd done to him. Back to verse 1. "And he cried out, 'Make everyone leave my presence.'" By cried, I'm thinking shouted. And I've got this picture of this stone-clad room, this hall, and it echoing, booming, and attendants scurrying off. This man had such authority. You imagine the looks on the brothers' faces as everyone runs off. Fearful. Guilty. Joseph could have dealt with his brothers in many ways. He could put them back in prison. He held them in custody earlier. He could have let them experience for longer a little of what he went through for the last few years. Made them suffer. Or he could have sent them home with no grain and said, "Don't darken my pyramid ever again." Execute them. It's well within his authority. Instead, what did he do? He chose to forgive them, love them, promised to bless them even, as long as they live. Not just them, but for the whole family. This is amazing, incredible demonstration of grace. Let's continue with our reading. "So, there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers." Joseph missed the perfect opportunity for public shaming. He confronted them behind closed doors to keep this within the family. And then we continue. "And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard all about it." Well, so much for keeping it within the family. The brothers, what were they thinking? Fear, worry. This guy's lost it. Here we go. Now the punishment. Joseph wanted to keep his emotions private, to keep the whole secret, to keep this whole problem, this whole issue secret from the Egyptians. But let me offer this. A mark of genuine forgiveness is to privately resolve the matter, not make it public. And once forgiven, this is so important, to leave it alone, not bring it up again. If it's done and it's forgiven, then it's finished. He didn't want others to know what the brothers had done to him. This is a perfect example for all of us, how we are to forgive, not keep it going, not telling others, not retelling the tale of woe. If we have truly forgiven, fully forgiven, we won't do that. I like the phrase, true forgiveness doesn't parade anyone's sins. 1 Peter chapter 4, love covers a multitude of sins. It's genuine forgiveness. But it's not easy, is it? Verse 3, Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Notice, all the staff had gone at this moment. It's just him and the brothers in this empty hall. No interpreter. So we can assume he is now talking directly at them, speaking in his native Hebrew. When had they last heard that voice and that name? Wide eyes. He asks, is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified in his presence. Understandable reaction? I think so. What did you say, Joseph? Joseph? Hang on, didn't we sell you as a slave? And then, importantly, in verse 4, Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. By asking them to come close, what does that mean? It wasn't that he was whispering, because he was shouting. No, it's talking about an intimacy. Remember, this is the second most important man in Egypt. Someone to be feared, at least respected. Previously, all their encounters have been them bowing and prostrate on the floor in front of him. You didn't look an official like that face to face, eye to eye. You looked down. You were subservient. Eye to eye contact in ancient cultures meant one or two things. It meant a sign of superiority or aggression. This is the ruler of Egypt saying, come close, brothers. He then says, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. This is news to Benjamin, a bit different to what he's been told all these years. But imagine the shock and fear with the other brothers. What were they thinking? Punishment, imprisonment, death? As we discussed earlier, Joseph had every reason and justification to serve justice here. But another important key point here is how Joseph dealt with them. He put them at ease. The test here, if you haven't 100% forgiven someone, then there's a tendency to want to make them squirm a little bit. Make them feel awkward. A little embarrassed, perhaps. That's not true forgiveness. Let's find out how Joseph dealt with his brothers. He continues. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. This insight is amazing. Rather than blame his brothers for the series of events, he sees God's hand in this. God's plan at work through his brothers' actions, and for the outcome that saves God's people from a famine and ultimately blesses them. Recognizing that God is sovereign in our lives and accepting his place, his role, God has sent him here. Wow. And then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of Egypt. So instead of challenging his brothers about why they treated him so viciously, he says, God sent me. Being imprisoned, falsely accused in Potiphar's house, God sent me. Languishing in prison until being asked to interpret dreams, God sent me. Being summoned before Pharaoh, God sent me. Being able to interpret dreams for Pharaoh, God sent me. He's the second in command of all Egypt. God sent me. to provide for my father and all his brothers a home with good shepherding land and food. During this time of famine, God sent me. To live our lives through the highs and the lows, the victories and defeats, through the encouraging relationships and those that are not so, the ones that turns against us. We have our own very personal roller coaster. But with the knowledge and security and certainty that God has a plan for each and every one of us, and like Joseph, I believe that God can, if we let him, use every situation, regardless of good or bad, for his purpose and glory. With this Joseph mindset, life becomes an adventure. What is God's plan with this situation? How will he use me? How will he use my gifts, my abilities, my relationships, my career, where I live? This encounter. As I said earlier, the most important part of this whole story is how Joseph dealt with his brothers. He could have punished them, and he would have been justified. But instead, without public display, he forgives them, restores the relationship, and then blesses them abundantly. Is this not a demonstration of justice, mercy, and grace? Exactly the same way that God deals with us. Joseph did not deal with them how they deserved. I'm sure most of us are familiar with the traffic cop comparison. If you get a ticket because you've been speeding and the police pull you over and give you that ticket, that's justice. Mercy is not getting what you deserve. For instance, that traffic cop saying, well, you've been speeding, but I'm going to let you off. Have a nice day. Drive carefully. Wow. That's mercy, not getting what you deserve. Grace, however, is something very different. It's getting something that you don't deserve. Joseph gave us a wonderful demonstration of this. Mercy and grace in action. Not punishing, not delivering justice in a way that the boys deserved, but forgiving them and showing them mercy in abundance. Let's summarise what Joseph can teach us then. 1. Technicolor junior fashion can lead to dangerous situations. I'm joking. 1. Talk privately. It's not a public disgrace. 2. Put people at ease. 3. 100% forgiveness. And 4. Act in mercy and grace. So what happens if you don't? If you don't forgive? There's an analogy of driving a car. You start off with a clear windscreen. You can see 100% all the way around. As you go through life, stuff gets thrown at the windscreen. Unless you forgive, unless you clear that windscreen, your vision ultimately will become less and less. Your vision of God's love outside the car, as it were, will get restricted. Secondly, if you don't put that demister on, your vision inside will get less and less. Your perspective of God's love gets reduced. I believe you get less satisfied with God. Forgiveness is difficult, especially when we have been hurt deeply by those you love deeply. Joseph loved his family, but jealousy, hate, and envy initially got in the way for his brothers. Even through all that, he still forgave them. Let's be honest, we all struggle with this at some point in our lives. But holding on to anger, resentment, and thoughts of revenge will only cause suffering. Because when we do that, we become both prisoner and jailer. Forgiveness helps us to remove the pain from our hearts. It allows us to move on without anger, contempt, or seeking revenge. We cannot move forward in our Christian life unless we are willing to forgive. So without forgiveness, we remain tied to those people who have hurt us. Those chains of bitterness. And until we can forgive that person, we will be our own jailer. Picture the word forgive. Forgiveness is not about F for forgetting, O, offering excuses, R, reconciliation. It may not always be about that. Or G, giving permission to reoffend. I, ignoring. V, victimization of self. Or E, empathizing. It's none of those. But let me tell you what it is. F for you, not the offender. O, being open and honest with oneself. R, restoring your relationship with God. G, giving up the resentment and bitterness. I, initiating change. And V, validating the injury. You sold me as a slave, Joseph told his brothers. And E, enabling the Holy Spirit to help you on that journey. My final thought here is, what would our communities look like if we acted more like Joseph? That mindset. I'm not being flippant here. I'm aware forgiveness is a massive subject, and yet the teaching appears to be so simple. I know it's not an easy thing to do, and depending on the circumstance, there's vast arrays of hurts and the different levels of the hurt where it registers. In preparing this, I'm challenged myself to let go of old hurts in a way that's 100% rather than 90 or 95 or even 99. I'm asking God to help in this process, and I believe he will. Joseph may well have had time to work on this, but he also had time to become very bitter. It doesn't say that Joseph with a light heart skipped into the room. No, this is tough stuff. Joseph, I believe, was led by God to demonstrate this forgiveness through his brothers to give us an example. We have the same promise, that God working in our lives, offering us mercy and grace. And we have the Holy Spirit to guide us and help us on this. And if we actively demonstrate these principles to the damaged and the difficult relationships with our friends, our neighbours, and most importantly our family, how different would our communities look? I've got a quote here to finish from Louis Medis. To forgive is to set the prisoner free, and to discover that the prisoner is you. Blessings to you all, and see you tomorrow as we continue this adventure with God together.